I'm sure you're all looking at the screen and saying, this is a webinar on Brexit. Why are we looking at a 40-year almost screen chart for the Nikkei and the Yen? It's a very good question, and it is, of course, a question to which I will provide an answer. As you all know, I like to do these webinars as colloquiums. If anyone has a comment or a question, please type it into chat. I have the chat up and I will look at it, and I'll be glad to stop and answer it. Other than that, let us see if we can have some fun with this very fraught topic. I was listening to the radio, the business radio on the way in, and it is, everybody's frantic about what's going on. I take a much more sanguine view of this. So why is the chart of the Nikkei going back to 1980 on your screen? Because what we are seeing is on the level of history. It's very difficult to get a grasp on it as it's happening. It's very difficult to look at the news flow, the market flow, and to discern, to tease out trends. What markets tend to do is react and overreact, okay? What the news tends to do is simply mimic that overreaction. I was listening on the way into an interview with Tom Keene and Mike McKee with Alan Greenspan, whose policies and whose pronouncements and whose opinions are absolutely worthy of listening to and of note. He's 90 years old, sharp as he ever was, sounds just like he ever did, and in many ways is just as cryptic as he ever was. But what we all have to remember, and this is the hardest thing to do because it doesn't give us any guidance, we look to the past for guidance to the future. We don't have a lot of choice, and it is a very, very human reaction. So one of the things that they were talking about on the way in this morning was some of the, how does this, of course, play out? Who has sat in the center of the international web of finance, banking, and politics for longer, with more experience and more power for a certain amount of time than Alan Greenspan? No one. So what did Alan Greenspan say, among other things? Well, and this is something I disagreed with and said so last week, and Alan Greenspan, of course, is the master of the cryptic. Probably my favorite business or finance, trading, banking quote of all time is, if you have, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, because many of these great phrases were never actually said exactly in the way we remember them. And this is one of those. But he said to some reporter who asked him about something, and he said, if you have clearly understood what I have said, then I have clearly misspoken. His point being that the pronouncements, and this is something which Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen have taken to the opposite extreme, and I think it's been a rather egregious failure, was instead of saying, I don't know, or instead of saying something which he has no idea whether it's true or not, but it'll sound good, he said something which left it entirely up to the listener to interpret, without at all admitting that he really didn't know, assuming that was the case at the time. The idea that for many times the people in charge have a technocratic understanding of the future is as silly as any other idea that's out there when it comes to finance, banking, international economics, or politics. It is simply not true. And when the Fed currently, under its transparency policy, which has completely fallen to pieces, of course, didn't they say in public back in December, which was exactly 6 months ago, that there'd be 4 rate hikes. What data were these people looking at? And how many are there going to be now? 0. So what value is a policy of transparency unless you're omniscient? And they're not omniscient. And I think Alan Greenspan and the Fed had a much more modest view of what they can accomplish, probably because they were, well, I'm not going to speculate on that, why. And that's the purpose of his cryptic statements. It doesn't undermine the Fed credibility, but it also doesn't admit, one, that they're going to put something out. You know the old line about writing commentary, give them a date or give them a level, but never give them both. Well, there's a reason for that, because you don't know the future. So when Janet Yellen and company come out and say we're expecting to do 4 rate hikes, what do they think the market's going to do? The market's going to take that as their policy, of course. And what have they had to do since then? Falling over themselves backwards. Okay, so what did is he Dr. Greenspan? He must be a doctor. He's got to have a doctorate, right? Former acolyte of Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and actually a book called Anthem that I read as a child thinking it was science fiction, which it was, sort of, but it was much more, of course, a political and economic tract. And a human tract about what drives human societies. But beyond that. So what did Alan Greenspan say? Which produced almost an immediate headline from the Bloomberg interview. And by the way, all these charts are all Bloomberg. He said he thought Scotland would vote to leave the UK and stay in the EU. And I have said repeatedly that I do not think that is as nearly a done deal as people think. One thing that this vote by the British has proven is how ramshackle and unsteady, one, is the euro, which we all know being currency traders, but two, is the European project itself. We get down to, and he mentioned it, the disparity of cultures. He quoted, Mr. Greenspan quoted someone saying in the early days of the euro that the euro will force the Italians to be Germans. A greater piece of nonsense has never been said. Well, it probably has, but I can't think of any related to this topic at the moment. If there's anything that human history proves, is that people are incredibly tenacious in their retention of their cultural, their linguistic, if you will, their tribal identities. And at the core, that's what we're talking about in Europe. But I'm going to address that in a second. So Mr. Greenspan said that he felt sure, if he had to make a prediction, it would be that Scotland would vote for independence after this to stay with the EU. I disagree with that. I think what the Scots are going to do is take a look at what they're at the ramshackle, at least very, ramshackle is an unfortunate choice of word, at the unstable and probably going to be increasingly unstable euro and behind it European Union, regardless of whether I think either of these is a good idea or not. That's not my point. My point is simply to stress that the stresses that were built in to both the euro and the EU have been ruthlessly exposed by this British vote. Again, I am not going to provide my opinion on both of these ideas, but I am trying to look at what's actually happening right now. Okay, so let us go first to, where are we? This one chart, which will supposedly show us how dangerous and frightening this is. Okay, this is, let's do this one. This is the max chart I could find of the euro. Back to, it's about back to about 1970. My mother used to say, when you and I were young, Maggie, barely actually, 1970. So is this historic? Well, not particularly. This chart looks a whole lot more historic. Let's take a look. This is the sterling by the year, and by many definitions, this is historic, for reasons we can all obviously see. There's never been a greater 1 or 2 day move in the euro, or probably in any other currency, unless it's, I'd have to check, but certainly in a major market currency than this move in the sterling. Astonishing. So as the cliche goes, we can all say we were there when we tell our grandchildren, who will be absolutely fascinated, as my children were when I told them, and they moved on right away to something else. But they were only 7.5. Okay, so Mr. Greenspan said that he thought the EU, Scotland would vote to leave the euro, to leave the UK. In this, I disagree entirely. What, as the weeks go forward, and the Europeans squabble, and other countries start to consider referenda for either leaving the euro or leaving the European Union, how stable are both of those institutions, the EMU and the EU, going to look? And who would want to join that? The Scottish and the British may have a contentious relationship, but it's a relationship that goes back more than 300 years as a united government and has served each very well. I know Scots may disagree with me and many English may disagree with me, but looking at it from the outside as an American, I think it has served both countries extremely well. And does anyone, and I do not, think that when they spend the next few weeks, so it will take at least a year or two to get this referenda into account. Now, Scotland voted, I think, 62 or 60% against leaving the EU. But as the weeks and the months roll forward, and the ructions, as they say with that old English word, continue on the continent, is Scotland really going to want to join that brouhaha? And my guess is they will not. Today I walk in and what do I see? I see a poll of Scotland I think, I just have it right in here. The last time Scotland voted on independence, they voted 55-45 to stay. That was only 2 years ago in 2014. So here we go. There's a poll of, after the British vote, there's a poll in Scotland. There's only one poll of 1,002 people. You kind of wonder why these polls always have these really odd numbers. 1,002, why not 1,000? Must have something to do with the statistical basis of the poll. I took statistics 25 years ago in grad school and do not remember what the reason is. But I like it. Statistics is something everyone should study because so much of what passes for statistical analysis is nothing more than using statistics to support a predetermined point of view. Or as Mark Twain said in his very famous quote, lies, damned lies, in increasing order of disrepute, lies, damned lies, and statistics. Anyway, I'm sure you've all heard that before. It's a great quote. If you're ever looking for a quote to cheer you up or to improve your view of mankind or to become more witty, just go to any collection of quotes and read Mark Twain's quotes. He's great. Okay, so this poll came out, conducted after the vote, as I say, asking the Scots whether they want another vote on referendum for independence. Now remember what we've been through. And what did the Scots vote? It was a plurality, not a majority. 44.7 said no new referendum on, 44.7, no new referendum on independence, and 41.9 was in favor of it. I do not think that given time, analysis, and more importantly, observation about what's about to take place and is taking place on the continent, that the Scots will vote to leave the UK and join as an independent nation. What are they doing, construction around here? There's a big crash here above me in my conference room where I do these webinars. And leave the European Union. Culturally, politically, economically, Scotland has far more in common with Britain than it has with the continent. And I will be very surprised if, as a result of this decision by the British electorate, that Scotland votes to leave the UK. And I think I may write a column on that this week, because that is entirely not the opinion of everybody in the media. But everybody in the media is looking backwards. They're looking at the last vote and they're saying, oh, they almost won. And they're looking at the percentages on the UK vote. But that's not the point. The point in this is looking forward. What view are the Scots and the Northern Ireland going to see when they make their decision? They are not going to be making their decision based on the past. They're going to make it on their observations and what they think those observations foretell for the future. Okay. So, let me backpedal a little bit. And I'm sure you've heard this, let's find a good one here. Okay, where's my Yuan? Did I not bring I didn't add, okay, I'll have to cover for that. Here it is, here, cool, okay. I am going to get around to talking about Britain, I promise. My point in showing you these charts, first of the Nikkei and the Japanese yen, and now this is the Chinese yuan, the onshore yuan traded in Shanghai. Look, you can barely see it, but look at that tiny little spike at the end. That is the post-UK vote. These are truly, there's a Chinese phrase, which is supposedly a Chinese curse, which is not Chinese at all, actually. But it gets repeated, and this is pre-internet. In the internet, we know that if somebody puts out a something which is not necessarily false, but enough people that is not necessarily true, but people pick up on it and it seems plausible, or it just makes a good story or a good picture, it gets flung around the world on the internet, and it suddenly becomes as if it was true. And there's a line which is supposedly a Chinese curse. I remember started a paper with in graduate school once. May you live in interesting times. It's supposedly a curse relating to something along Chinese history of the year of the years of the warlords or the warring kingdoms, when there is no central stability in China. And this has been a periodic cycle in Chinese history. As a new dynasty is replaced by an old dynasty, a failing dynasty is replaced by another, or an invasion. A quite common theme in continental powers bordered by other powerful entities. There was a time in, I think, the 700s where there was a Tibetan empire coming out of the Tibetan plateau, which ruled a good portion of China. So on and on and on. I just mean that the countries, and this is European history. The link, of course, back is the EU, which I will talk to in a minute. The United States and Britain are blessed by geography. Australia, too, you could say, are blessed by geography. They do not have any powerful land-based continental enemies. There's a much older theory of history that puts much more emphasis on the immutable facts of geography for determining the types of historical experiences countries, polities, and cultures have. It's something we have ignored very much. It's like we have ignored over the past 50 years the immutable value and problems that are culture-based. As I alluded to earlier with that quote that the euro will force Italy to be Germany. Nonsense, will not happen. People are not like that. Human culture is not like that. Okay, but on to that. So what do we have here? We have the Chinese yuan, controlled currency. This right here is last August. Does this look like a mercantilist chart to you? Of course it does. China's like Germany. And I'm going to get back to why this is not going to be the huge problem for the British that everyone is saying it is going to be. I'll tell you why. I don't think it is. China's devaluing its currency, big time. And what is that going to cause? Well, two things. It caused, ironically, a much stronger Japanese yen. Why? Here's the yen. I should have put a yen and I should have put a yen and Yuan chart on the same page. But you can see from the middle of 2015 on the other chart, August, right about here, the yuan value goes down. And what is the opposite effect in yen? It goes up big time. Why? Well, because among other reasons, everybody is getting as much money out of China as they can and they're putting in Japan. If you have a view that this, and look at the price of gold, they didn't put up a gold chart, but we have the same effect. If your view is that this is a long-term economic and financial problem, that we're headed towards a period of instability, which I think is probably true, then you put your money in Asia, in Japan. And in the rest of the world, you put it in the United States, and you put it in developed countries' bonds. Here, take a look at this. US, UK, and German 10-year yields. We all know the US is white. Great Britain is, Germany is yellow, and Great Britain is green. And we all know bond prices work opposite of rates. We all know the reasons why. What is this chart? People are buying bonds like bananas because they are concerned about the future. Because that's what financial markets do when there is turmoil. Oops, wait, this chart's not up. Sorry. Okay, there we go. So looking forward, and this is the mirror image of the two charts we saw before. So let's go back to the yuan. This is not much detail on this chart, but it is a chart of the Chinese yuan from 1985. Now, I was in China here, and many times since then, but here, back in 1987, 88, before really the Deng Xiaoping reforms had taken place. Reality, as far as the currency goes, from about here. So we're looking at from a little after 1995, for almost 20 years, China kept this is a period of enormous development in China, basically a changing of the Chinese economic system, a freeing, if you will, of the Chinese people to, as Johnson said, there's no more innocent, what do you say, job? No more innocent endeavor, probably didn't use endeavor, than the getting of money. What does he mean by that? That if your main purpose is to make money, then you're not particularly interested in ideology or anything else. Your main purpose is actually to do whatever is necessary to make money. And so this is the Chinese people doing whatever is necessary to make money, assisted by the government with a very low and fixed exchange rate. Okay. Are we headed back to that level? Well, it certainly looks like it. It certainly looks like we're headed back to the period of 2005, just under 7. China is telling you, the government is telling you by this, regardless, ignore rhetoric, ignore statistics. I mean, statistics out of China, economic statistics. It's telling you where its concerns are. And these concerns predated any British vote. Okay? So, go back. Let me just find a good one here. You go. Those are the wrong ones. Here we go. This is the Dow and the FTSE. Going back to the financial crisis. So going back to the British vote. So all of the analysis that most of the analysis, let me be discreet, of the analysis that you're hearing is backward looking. It is extrapolating what went past, what went before, to predict what comes next. In this case, I would be very careful of doing that. Because if it is, as I think, an exposure of this vote in Britain has exposed many of the ideas that people were still trading on and viewing about the EU and the EMU that were not ever really true. The euro has not provided benefits for many of the countries and populations under its control. It certainly looks now that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair's decision not to join the euro was the right decision for England, for the UK, for the Scottish and the Welsh, the British, the English, and the Northern Irish people, Northern Ireland. It certainly looked like the right decision. And although much of the commentary that you're reading, you know, is that old famous line from Pauline Kael, I'm sure you've heard it, talking about, I think, the election of Richard Nixon. Forgive me if I've used this before. And she said, and again, it's a paraphrase. This is not exactly what she said, but it's better in its remembered form. She said, supposedly, how can Nixon have won? I don't know anyone who voted for him. As a image of innocent parochialism, it's perfect, which is why it keeps getting repeated. It strikes me very much that a lot of the analysis of this British vote is exactly the same. Almost everyone I know, you all know I live in Manhattan, thinks that this is a terrible idea without a lot of analysis. The idea that this ever tightening European Union is a good thing. Well, the Brits have just said, by a fairly substantial margin, it is not. Let us take a step back and think about why this may or may not be true. Let us not approach it with the preconceptions of a Pauline Kael, who gathered her opinions on politics from her friends. Guess what? We all choose our friends by often their reflection of our own opinions. How many of us, again, this is the tribal nature of human culture, how many of us have a great many friends with diametrically opposed political opinions to our own? Very few. I have quite a few actually, and I'm not touting myself, it's just kind of the nature of where I live and where I went to school and all those things. Most of us choose friends who agree with us. And we set about then for the rest of our life reinforcing each other's opinions, not doing a lot of analysis and not doing a lot of examination. Reading things that support our opinions, and in general acting as if our political opinions were some sort of received wisdom. They are not. So let us continue our step backwards. What is the purpose of the European Union? not a rhetorical question. The purpose of the year, well, it is a rhetorical question, and then I'll provide the answer. The purpose of the European Union, as we have examined more than once in these sessions because it's an integral part of what we're doing, is to avoid the debacle of the first 50 years of the 20th century in Europe. 2 world wars, I don't know how many dead, maybe 50, maybe 75 million in 2 wars. Or as Churchill used to say, that the First World War and the Second World War were properly viewed as a new 30 years war, from 1914 to 1945, with a 20-year interregnum in the middle. And that is the proper view, because the Second World War is absolutely a continuation of both the hatreds, the competitions, and the failures of the First World War. So that's the basis of the European Union. Everything else is a graft, is an afterthought, and it is a noble purpose. No political leader, no moral political leader could want to repeat the experience of Europe from 1914 to 1945. So that's the basis of the European Union, but it's a political basis. Everything else is an addendum. It's an add-on. Yes, a free trade zone is a very good idea. But the founders, the intellectual founders, Jean Monnet and others of the European Union, conceived of first the Coal and Steel Pact in a political context. In the environment of post-World War, immediate post-World War II, coal and steel were the essence of strategic economic power of those nations. This is before the invention of information technology, before the understanding of before the nuclear race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Coal and steel. The First World War and the Second World War, although you have to include aluminum in the Second World War, were products of oil and coal and steel. Steel built the tanks, steel built the battleships, aluminum built the airplanes, in the Second World War at least. The countries which had the greatest prowess in these areas were the ones who founded and proffered to the world the most effective war machines. So the Coal and Steel Pact tells you by its very nature in the beginning that what the attempt was to rein in, to bind the countries of Europe into an international organization that could never again drown the world in blood as it did in those 30 years. Now you can take a longer historical view, and that is that the evolution of technology mediated through human culture and human nature would almost inevitably produce that kind of outburst, but that's a little beyond our scope here. And it gets into philosophy very quickly, and also religion, which I don't go to. Anyway, so the origin of the EU, disguised as it may be, the ever-tightening union, is in the political debacle of the first 50 years of the 20th century. It has used the very logical and in many ways beneficial economic integration of first the Coal and Steel Pact and the Common Market, then the Maastricht Treaty, unfortunately leading to the euro, to produce what it hoped would be a continent of Europeans. Now, one thing that's interesting about the British vote, and I have one of my relatives, his daughter, who's 14, almost 15, is visiting us from Italy, from southern Italy. And she's here to study English for the summer. She's staying with us. And so she and I were discussing the British vote when we went out to dinner on Friday. And she is very much against it. She thinks it's a terrible vote. She views herself maybe 1/3 European and 2/3 Italian. And it's certainly true that in Britain, the age split in this vote was quite pronounced. Younger people, younger than 40, I guess, voted in favor by a majority in most areas of the country to retain the ties to the EU, and older people voted against it. I'm not going to make a judgment on that, whether this is youth against wisdom or the future against the past. But there is a skew, and it is true, one, that these kinds of cultural identities go with generations, and two, that the younger generation is far more European than the older generations, because they have grown up underneath the EU, period. Italy's been a member from the beginning. Even Britain's been a member since 1973. So the idea of this European organization, if not federation and if not federalism, is something which is much more common among the European younger people. Of course, the problem with this is that the European structure has not delivered for the younger generation in a good portion of Europe. Unemployment rate in Italy is still over 20%. I think it is in Spain too. It might be lower in Spain. Youth unemployment from 19 to 30 or 35, in many of those countries is 40% and higher. That's a terrible, terrible waste of a generation. If you can't find a job until you're 35, much of your approach to work is changed, downgraded. How do you have a career? How do you have something if your years from 25 to 35 you can't find work? What do you do? Okay, so even though there is an emotional identification, some of the realities of the European situation. So the political union is the purpose of the EU. But it is one which has been obtained in many cases, or at least pushed forward in many cases, by non-democratic means. Democracy is a powerful motivator of populations. And you cannot, as the Europeans are finding out, push people into structures that they do not want to be in and do not feel that they have any say over. The European project, if it is to succeed, must, in my mind, reform. I don't know if this will be, but it is certainly the note on what this British vote has been taken. How does the euro provide another thing? Let me backtrack a little bit. I was listening to Alan Greenspan this morning, as I said, coming in. And one of the things he was saying, that the reason we are seeing so many of these political movements and political turmoil, and that's what this is, around the world, certainly in the developed world, and really everywhere, because what happens in the developed world spills over immediately into the less developed and emerging market countries, is because productivity and income growth have flatlined the past 5 or 6 years. That's just a fact. They have, by any measure you want to use. Even without complaining about the measure and the statistics, you just use the same measure you did before, and it's absolutely true. I know it's true because I've experienced it in my own life. as far as wages and things like that go. And so he was dwelling upon how this is fomenting this dangerous, as he put it, growth in instability, which is really the reflection in many ways, not completely, but in many ways, of economics into politics. For the euro, he blamed it on Greece, which I think is not true. Greece is a symptom, not a cause. And he said Greece should leave the euro. Greece probably should leave the euro. But Greece is simply a symptom of the greater financial dysfunction of the euro. So productivity. If for the last 5 years, and he didn't get to this point, I actually had to get out of the car because I'd gotten here, but I very much wanted to stay. I had to prepare for this webinar, but I wanted at least get my charts and send them over to the station. I want to very much hear his answer. Well, we have one analysis or one point of view that productivity, the lack of productivity, is driving a lot of this decline in the stagnation in income. Well, what has changed over the past 5 years? There's that Reinhardt and Rogoff out of Harvard's thesis that after a financial calamity such as we experienced in 2008, it inevitably takes at least a decade to get back. And so that this is not a reflection necessarily of any declining trend in Western economies and developed economies, not just Western, but simply a reflection of how long it takes to recover from this type of financial crisis and financial shock. That's one view. It's unproven, of course. There's another view that aging populations are contributing to this. And there's some truth in that too. I think there's probably some truth in all of these explanations. And the final one, I think, is one which I was hoping Mr. Greenman would get to, at least as far as looking at it, if not coming to a conclusion, was that the imposition by the world central banks of this experimental zero and negative rate policy has had, since it's never been tried before, in the history of world finance, is having rather unexpected effects. Exactly the opposite of what was predicted. And you've heard this from me a number of times in many contexts. Negative interest rates have not sponsored growth. They've sponsored higher stock markets, but no understandable, appreciable increase in growth. In fact, if you look at the growth rates, they are declining. Not, I didn't put any GDP up because I covered that in other recent webinars. They're declining. They're not rising. And there's no doubt, in my mind anyway, that one of the reasons are the distortions in the economic system induced by zero interest rates. You cannot falsify one of the basic price signals of a capitalist economy and expect it to perform. So you have all of these factors playing into the British view on what to do about the EU. One of David Cameron's phrases, and another reason, of course, that this British vote, not being British, of course, and having visited the UK many times, but never having lived in London, and you never really know a place until you live there, and its people until you live there and speak their language. I think one of the miscalculations of what the people who wanted to remain, David Cameron, interestingly, both British parties, all three actually, the rump of the Lib Dems, I saw on Patty Ashdown on TV saying what a terrible, he's a leader of the Liberal Democrats, which are basically a extinct party right now, or close to it. All bemoaning the British vote. It is interesting. Think about what you have here, which is why it's such a fascinating topic. You have the three major parties in the founding nation of sort of the world's modern democratic societies, all three parties and all three party leaders campaigning on one side of an issue, and the voters don't listen. It's rather astonishing. As Churchill said, tell the British people the truth. They're robust people. They can handle it. Well, I can't think of a stronger assertion of the independent strength and, if you will, intellectual analysis. I know many of I'm reading some of, I read a lot of the press on both sides, and I have friends of mine with whom I disagree with violently about some of these topics. And we do lots of emails and chats and ongoing conversations about many, many topics, including this one. And I've seen articles in various of the more strident leftist outlets that this is xenophobia. This is nonsense. There's a strain of it in everything. No political movement, no political opinion composed of millions of people is going to be without many different strains. But it is just as possible to make, in fact, it's more possible, to make a rational argument with very good points for why people should leave. So the problem that the Brits had during this vote, one of them was that the campaign to stay was largely one of negatives. British economy is going to end, there's going to be a recession, going to lose 10% of GDP in 20 minutes, all this stuff. And people didn't buy it. One, it's not true, but people didn't buy it. Another thing Al Greenspan was talking about was currency interventions. Why he thinks that they're a really bad idea. When he was president, chairman of the Fed, he was there for almost 20 years, I think. It had started out in the mid-'80s with currency interventions being very much a popular tool of central banks. And it no longer is, and there's a very good reason. One is basically because it doesn't work. But two, because it's unnecessary. As the phrase goes, the cure to high oil prices is high oil prices. The cure to a low pound is a low pound, or a high pound is a high pound. Currencies and markets have self-correcting mechanisms. And it is counterproductive for central banks to assume otherwise, and to assume that they are there to provide the measure of sanity to the insane markets. There are things that are absolutely responsible and necessary for central banks to do, but it's a real question. This is what Greenspan was saying, Mr. Greenspan was saying, Chairman Greenspan was saying. Oh, we didn't put in quite those phrases. Markets have self-correcting mechanisms. Euro goes down long, sterling stays down here for a certain amount of time. What's going to happen? People are going to start buying it. For obvious reasons, I expect it to go up. On and on and on. So on the topic of the forward view from this vote, we're running out of time here, so I want to see if we can coalesce some of the themes here. The basic theme I think we should all take from this is that this is one of those moments where it is not as useful as one thinks to operate on prior assumptions. Everybody, I mean, it was a fascinating night on Thursday for me, sitting here and blogging on our site and sending out commentary, putting up charts and doing the things. I was here till about midnight. I left just about the time that I left when the BBC, which was very much for continued association with the EU, predicted that the referendum would succeed. That entire group of analysis going forward is something we need to pay attention to as not a predictor, but as one scenario. This will not play out as prior analysis predicts. That I can guarantee. One of the things that people have said is that this is going to be enormously costly for the British economy. I don't think that's true. That the Europeans are going to try and freeze them out. I don't think that's true. Germany is a nation with 50% of its GDP based in exports. Britain's a huge consumer of German products. You really think the Germans are going to throw up trade barriers? Not a chance. Not a chance. People are saying that the EU now has to be extremely firm. It has to be ruthless. It has to be tough in negotiations with Britain. Otherwise, everyone else will get up and leave. That's not true either. You know why? Because if they are, they still can't prevent any other single country from leaving. They can't. What are they going to do? Send the Bundeswehr there? Bad picture here, especially if European. Over to Belgium? Didn't they try that once or twice? The structure that will evolve from this. The Europeans want to save the European Union. I'm not sure the euro can be saved, frankly. But for the European Union, certainly I believe a free trade zone is a very good idea for Europe, and I think that will remain. And Britain will be a part of it, although maybe not as tight as it was. The sense that Britain will suddenly disappear and become isolationist is preposterous. It's not their history, it's not their culture, and it's not in anybody's interest. So don't look for it to happen. This is what I mean. Be careful in this case, very careful. And this, of course, strays over into our ideas about currency trading and the positions we're taking, the view we take forward. That this is going to be as predicted. I think in a number of cases, certainly that one, for example, right there, that the necessary EU response to this is harsh, is preposterous. If they do, they guarantee other votes to leave, which is why they won't do it. Does anyone think that the British are alone in their devotion primarily to their nation and their own economy and well-being, and to the well-being of their children? Children grow up, they turn into adults, and they need jobs, and need a growing economy, and parents want the best for their children. They do not want to lead their children into a world war, although they never think it, or they do not want to lead them into a declining economy. How best to accomplish that is one of the reasons behind this vote. So when you are thinking about how this will play out, one, be patient. Sometimes, as I've said many times, the best thing to do for countries is to do nothing. This is probably not one of those cases, but it does mean you should take a step back. And do not expect this to play out immediately. I've written about this several times. The idea that this is going to be an immediate severance, that the Germans and the French and the Belgians and everybody else on the continent are going to say, okay, you're gone, out, trade barriers, it's nonsense, complete and utter nonsense. Because if they start, one of the problems with the euro, not only is that it hasn't delivered economic well-being to about half of the population under its jurisdiction, it's that it's, how shall I put this delicately, its rules have been harshly and unevenly enforced, shall we say. The idea that a treaty, such as the Maastricht Treaty, that sets out a 3% limit of GDP, of a budget deficit to GDP per year, is going to be followed is preposterous. Rules do not enforce a system of independent actors. Of all the people on the planet who would know this, you'd think it would be the Europeans who put together the League of Nations after the First World War. There were treaties that everybody signed outlawing war. How did that work out? Rules are unenforceable amongst nations unless the nations find those rules based on their own analysis to be to their benefit. And for many people, many nations under the euro was not to their benefit. I think you add to this some of the emotional problems, the emotional ideas of declining populations and everything else, and you end up with a very toxic brew. Okay, folks, I think we have reached, well, let me do a little bit more. I think we have 3 more minutes here. So Europe has a new dawn here. Britain has a new dawn here. Or are we looking at the failures of systems and attempted economic integration, attempted financial and currency integration leading to more failures? I do not think that. I am an optimist about this particular vote. And the reason is because the systems in front of us clearly need, at the very least, reformation. And they were not being reformed. Not only that, were they not being reformed, but there was no pressure to reform. Aside from the emotional reaction of being annoyed, if you believe in the future of the European Union, at Britain's elected departure, once you get over that, you will quickly realize that the structure, as it's put together, as it's conceived, its purpose and its execution is not succeeding. I said years ago, not years, almost 10 years ago now, well, not 10 years ago, about 6 years ago, when the Greek crisis blew up in 2011 over the European, the euro, that one absolutely predictable result of this crisis, and not only its crisis, but how it has played out, is that nobody else is going to join the euro. Remember, originally, the purpose of joining the European Union, if you join the European Union, as many Eastern European countries have, then you are required at some undetermined future point to adopt the euro. Do you think anyone is going to try and enforce that? Do you think Poland is going to give up its zloty and join the euro? Not a chance. There is no country of a substantial size that is going to join the euro now. So that motion forward is halted immediately, grounded. And if the Europeans are not careful with their response to this departure, then you will end up with the same type of cessation of forward movement in the project that they say that they want. Final word. This is a highly emotional topic for many people, certainly many Europeans. I've encountered this time and time again. But it is not one to which emotion is well served, because there are many facts right in front of us if we take the time to view them. And we should, as we look at this going forward, and also as we judge our trading positions and what to think about where we're going. Okay, folks, I thank you all very much for attending. I hope this has been useful. I hope it's been enjoyable. And we will do it again next week with another topic that I'm not sure yet because I haven't chosen yet. So everybody have a great day. If you have any questions, I will put my email up there. Actually, I'll ask Adinda to put it up there on the Forex Live chat. And please send me any comments, criticisms, or questions. Again, thank you all very much, and have a good day. Take care.